40 years ago, I set out for the Yucatan to do the field work for my doctorate. I was going to the heartland of the Maya to test a new theory. A theory that I had developed relating to how people see and name basic colors. For years, I had been repeatedly warned by my faculty advisors not to waste my time. I was told that the color name data that had been collected from all around the world was a mess. It seemed to be telling us that every language named colors uniquely, which, I was told, could only mean that the naming of colors was an entirely random process. If I tried to work with that mess, it would ruin my career before it got started. But I knew something the faculty didn't. I have Asperger's syndrome. I'm an Aspie. In particular, I'm the kind of Aspie who sees patterns everywhere, even where other people don't see them at all. So even before I had developed sound scientific reasons to believe that the experts were wrong, I knew they were wrong, because I could see a pattern in the color name data, a pattern that everyone else had missed. At first, I considered listening to my faculty advisor's warnings and taking the safer route. I could select a more conservative topic for my dissertation and then return to tackle the color name problem in a few years, or perhaps even wait until after I got tenure. But that pattern was there, and I did have logic on my side. Just think about it. If our eyes are all built the same way, and they process light the same way, shouldn't we all see colors the same way? And if we all see colors the same way, surely it only makes sense that no matter what language we speak, we should all name those colors the same way. When we look at the spectrum as it appears in a rainbow, how many colors do you see? 4? 5? 6? If we ask native speakers of many different languages, we'll get a number of different answers. Some recognize 2 different colors. Others recognize 3, or 4, or 5, or even 6. This was part of the reason the experts thought that the process of dividing up the spectrum and naming those subdivisions was random. After all, different languages divide the spectrum differently. How could that not mean that the process is random, right? But what if there was a different explanation? What if we had been looking at the wrong thing all along? The experts who study color names had been focusing their attention on discovering the best example of any particular color name that they happened to be studying. The technical term for the best example is called the prototype. Moreover, to those experts, it appeared as if the boundaries between the subdivisions of the spectrum were fuzzy. What I saw, on the other hand, was a limited number of boundaries that were not all equally as strong, or blatant, or obvious. The technical term for this is salience. A boundary that is more obvious or blatant is referred to as being more salient. A boundary that is less so is less salient. So we have a small set of boundaries that are used in their order of salience, from most salient to least salient. That would mean that if we discover a language that divides up the spectrum into 2 subdivisions, each of which has a unique color name, we should be able to predict with a high degree of accuracy, approaching certainty, which of the boundaries from our small set are recognized in that language. We should also be able to make a similar prediction for any language that divides the spectrum into 3 color terms, or 4 or 5 or 6, or any number for that matter. My contention at this point was that the set of boundaries was actually the predictable and unavoidable result of the natural process by which our eyes turn light into the electrical signals that the eye then sends to the brain. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of what appear at first glance to be random divisions of the spectrum. Native Mayan speakers call blue and green by one name, Yash. Not until after they had come into contact with the Spanish did they restrict Yash to the color green and add the Spanish word azul to mean blue. On the other hand, native speakers of Amharic, a language in Ethiopia, called orange and red by the same name, Kai. Not until they made contact with Portuguese explorers who introduced the idea that orange was a separate color from red did Kai become restricted to red, was a new term, Vertukan, added to mean orange. In the highlands of New Guinea, the native speakers of the language known as Dani had only 2 words to describe colors, Mola, which included white, red, orange, and yellow, and Mili, which included black, green, and blue. The pattern I saw was different because it focused my attention on the location of the boundaries between color names instead of on the best example prototypes. And that made all the difference in the world. The reason the color name data appeared to be random was because over the previous 4 centuries, every explorer, adventurer, scientist, and scholar who had ever gone to a newly discovered land to learn the local language had learned that language's color names in a different, almost random way. There was no overall standardized method by which the meanings of color names were learned and, more importantly, recorded. To me, this meant that there was no easy, let alone accurate, way to compare the color names. That in turn could only mean that the apparent randomness was not in the data itself, but was a product of the many different ways the data had been collected. In technical terms, the randomness was not a property of the data, it was what we call an artifact of the data collection methods. The problem began with the earliest explorers and adventurers who learned color names by just pointing to a nearby object and asking a native speaker of the language being studied, "What color's that?" Then they would give the equivalent name in English or whatever other language they themselves spoke. But none of those early explorers or adventurers ever tried to discover where the boundaries between colors were located. Later scholars and scientists attempted to discover a more precise understanding of the particular language's color terms by bringing with them sets of colored objects used by dye makers to standardize the colors of dyes. These sets consisted of strips of colored yarn or chips of colored paper that looked like nothing so much as the sample color strips you can find in any store that sells house paint. And even later scholars going out to ascertain a yet more precise understanding of a particular language's color terms brought with them an extensive set of professional-grade color chips, such as the Moncel chips, which eventually became the standard. The end result was a database of color names of varying degrees of accuracy, with no way to accurately compare them. But there was more. The pattern I saw through all that apparent randomness told me something else, too. It told me that the process of seeing colors, the process by which light is transformed into electrical signals in the nerves at the back of the eye, was almost certainly the source of the pattern I had seen in the color name data. Anthropologists have a technical definition of something called a basic color term, and refer to all the basic color terms in a particular language as that language's basic color lexicon. The easiest way for me to explain what makes a color name a basic color term is to just list them, because English has only 11 basic color terms in its basic color lexicon. In English, the basic colors are black, white, red, yellow, green, blue, brown, purple, pink, orange, and gray. These are the common color names that everyone who speaks English shares. There are lots of other color names, such as cornflower, to take one example, which are not basic terms because they're defined as a shade of a basic color, yellow in this instance, and because such color names are not universally used or universally recognized as color names by all English speakers. To prove my theory is correct, I would have to do more than just point out a pattern that others had missed in the color name data. I would have to prove, scientifically, that the pattern actually existed in the data, and then I would have to explain what that pattern meant. To do that, I would have to go out into the field and collect new, more precise data than anyone else had collected up to that time, from native speakers of several completely unrelated languages. But there was yet another problem. For well over a century, the scientists who study color had described colors in terms of three variables that were traditionally known as dimensions. This was the three-dimensional theory of color. The three dimensions were hue, saturation, and lightness. Lightness is the term used for the third dimension when studying color based on paint or dye as the source of the colors. When dealing with light as the source of colors, the third dimension was more often known as brightness. For all that time, every color that human beings could see could be represented in terms of these three dimensions. Until, that is, the traditional color theory failed. The reasons for that failure are technical, but take a look at what are sometimes called neon colors that are used for safety vests and the like. Take a picture of one of these vests. Does the picture look as bright as the original? The failure of the traditional three-dimensional color theory meant that even before I could collect any data, I would have to come up with a new and better way to analyze it after I had collected it. So I read through all the literature on the subject that the university library had. The newest work done by the experts in vision pointed towards the necessity of adding a fourth or even fifth dimension to correct the problem. It seems that if you show a person a series of colored lights in a darkened room, they give a surprisingly different set of answers to the question, "What color do you see?" than if they were shown the same colored lights in bright sunlight. I settled on a four-dimensional theory of my own, derived from the best ideas available at the time, and called the new fourth dimension the adaptation state of the eye, or just adaptation. It measured the background lighting level when test subjects were shown colored lights. Using my four-dimensional theory of color perception as a theoretical foundation, I built a colorimeter that produced colored lights by allowing me to vary the dimensions of hue and brightness while keeping saturation at maximum and adaptation constant. That's how I came to find myself in a small village in the Yucatan testing the color vision of men and women, which, strangely enough, had not been done to any great extent before then, using my colorimeter to gather data that was much more extensive and precise than anyone had done before. I'm not going to go into all the details of my dissertation here, or of my adventures in the Yucatan, but what it showed was that, as predicted, the pattern was there, and the cause of the pattern did lie within our eyes. Within our eyes, specifically in the retina at the back of the eye, light is transformed into electrical signals, which are then sent by way of the optic nerve to the back portion of the brain for further processing. This is where our brains make sense of what we see. The retina contains three different types of cells that are sensitive to visible light of different wavelengths. These cells are called cone cells because they are shaped a bit like cones. The cells that are sensitive to light of longer wavelength are called red cones because the electrical signals they produce are interpreted by the brain as red. Thus we can call the electrical signals generated by red cones R signals. The cells that are sensitive to medium wavelength of light are called green cones for much the same reason. So we call the signals generated by green cones G signals. And the cells that are sensitive to short wavelengths of light are called blue cones and produce B signals. All the colors that we see are due to the interactions of the electrical signals generated by these three types of cone cells. So, to recap, visible light of a longer wavelength will stimulate red cones to produce an R signal, which will be interpreted by our brains as the color red. Visible light of a short wavelength will stimulate blue cones to produce a B signal, which will be interpreted by our brains as the color blue. And visible light of a medium wavelength will stimulate green cones to produce a G signal, which will be interpreted by our brains as the color green. These are the three primary colors of light. But what about yellow? After all, in elementary school art class, everyone was taught that yellow is a primary color. Where does yellow fit into this picture? As so often happens, things are a bit more complicated than they seem at first glance. There's a fourth type of electrical signal created in the retina when electrical signals of equal strength from both red cones and green cones stimulate a specific kind of intermediate nerve cell. Our brains interpret the electrical signals generated by this intermediate type of cell as either yellow or brown, depending on the lighting levels. For convenience, I call this the O signal. Thus, within our eyes, the entire range of visible light is changed into four types of electrical signals: R, O, G, and B. As if that wasn't complicated enough, however, within the brain, the combination of an O signal and a B signal can cancel out each other's hues. So can the combination of an R signal and a G signal. But neither of the signals in one of these combinations affect each other's saturation or brightness. Only the hue disappears. The result is that if there's no other hue present, the color appears as gray. If there is another hue present, however, that hue appears lighter, more like a pastel. All right, why are we going into such detail, and what does this all mean? Well, what I showed in my dissertation was that the 16 possible combinations of these four signal types, R, O, G, and B, along with the two combinations OB and RG, are sufficient to define all possible basic color terms that can exist in any and all languages, and at the same time indicate where the boundaries between colors should be located. This is the ultimate source of the pattern I had seen in the color name data. The best way I can think of to show how the four electrical signals created in the eye can represent all the basic colors is by using a form of Karnaugh table. The Karnaugh table I used consists of 4 rows of 4 columns. I begin by placing an R in each box in the 2 columns on the left of the table to represent the R signal. Then I put a G in each box in the top 2 rows. Next, I put a B in each box in the center 2 rows, and then an O in each box in the center 2 columns. Now we combine them. In each box that has an O and a B, we have an OB combination, and in each box that has an R and a G, we have an RG combination. These combinations will lighten any color signal already in that box, or will be represented as gray if there is no other signal in that box. At this point, we can see the 16 possible combinations of the 4 signal types. We see the situation where there is no signal of any kind. Absence of any color is black, so we put black in this box. The box with all 4 signal types represents the situation where all cone types are being represented by light and produce their respective signals. That box is where we put white. The 2 boxes that complete the diagonal contain the 2 combinations that give us gray. Next are the 3 cone type signals that represent red, green, and blue. So what do we do with the O signal? In the bottom row, we find the O signal alone in a box. That's brown. In the top row, we find the O signal with the RG combination. That gives us light O, or yellow. The next 3 colors to appear, orange, purple, and pink, all contain red cone R signals that are not part of an RG combination. Next comes a B signal with an RG combination, which gives us light blue. There's no basic color term for this color in English, but there is in Russian, and it is possible that this color will be the next one to become represented by a basic color term in English. The three remaining colors are blue-green, light-green, and yellow-green. Will any language ever develop basic color terms for these three colors? Personally, I doubt it, because the boundaries that define these colors are not very salient. But if at some future date such color names were to become part of any language, that would complete the set, and there would be no more. It was not obvious at the time, but the work I did to get my doctorate had ramifications far beyond just color names or even just anthropology. To explain what I mean, we need to start with a quick look at the state of anthropology at the time I was studying for my doctorate. It was an academic subject in transition. Back then, anthropology was divided into four major divisions called subdisciplines. The first subdiscipline, the one that comes to mind for most people when they hear the word anthropology, is cultural anthropology. In the public's mind, cultural anthropologists are the people who go to faraway places to live with a remote tribe, or in a small farming village, or even with an ethnic group in a modern city. This was not my particular subdiscipline, so I didn't study a lot of cultural anthropology, although I did assist with data analysis on a number of different cultural anthropology projects. The second division was archaeology, and yes, although I was not studying to be an archaeologist, I did participate in a couple of archaeological digs, mostly doing microphotography and identification of food remains. The third division was physical anthropology, which at the time was becoming more well known as biological anthropology. This was where I studied evolution, genetics, and climate. While physical anthropology was not, strictly speaking, my subdiscipline, it was important to what I intended my career to be, so I did study it diligently. My primary field of study was the fourth and final division, linguistic anthropology, which at the time was increasingly being referred to as linguistic and cognitive anthropology, or occasionally just cognitive anthropology. Although my dissertation concerned a problem in linguistics, I've always identified myself as a cognitive anthropologist. Up to that time, anthropology had been focused primarily on human behavior, the things people do. But thanks to new technology, particularly the use of computers to deal with huge amounts of data, we in anthropology started looking for the roots of behavior in our own biology. For example, the one thing that made the linguistic anthropology study of language unique at that time was its fascination with the idea that the essence of all human language was buried deep in the very structure of the brain. Understand the structure of the brain, and we would develop a set of universal characteristics that guided and shaped all human language. In essence, linguistics was bridging into the study of cognition at that time. But cognitive studies went beyond just language. Increasingly, science was finding that biology underlay all behavior. And for many of us, it became obvious that to study the mind and behavior, we would first have to look at how the human brain worked. Only then could we understand the relationship between the brain, the mind, behavior, and culture. It was at about this time that the most famous feral child of all time was discovered living in a house in Los Angeles. Jeannie, as she came to be called, was about 14 and had never learned to talk. Some of the best linguists and psychologists in the world were called in to evaluate the young girl and see what could be done to help her. But it was already too late. Jeannie did manage to learn the meanings of some words, but she never learned how to talk. Jeannie's case verified that all people must learn a language during a specific period in the development of their brain, or they will never learn any language. This was irrefutable fact. During these same years, we learned from the study of identical twins that other aspects of our behavior had biological roots. Just how deep these roots extended had yet to be determined, but it was obvious, to some of us at least, that they would be found to go deep. Thus, in order to eventually be able to make sense of human culture and behavior, it seemed obvious to me that first we had to understand the human brain and how it works. Which meant, of course, that during my years at the university, I studied as much as I could about the structure and function of the human brain, and what we knew, at the time, of the structure of the brains of our great ape cousins, along with what we knew of their behavior, which led me to further study the evolution of the nervous system from the simplest organisms all the way up through human beings. The final bit of my time at university was spent learning about machine intelligence, computers. This put me on the extreme leading edge of what was, at the time, considered to be anthropology proper. While I was in grad school, there were two competing theories put forth to explain human behavior. The older tabula rasa, or blank slate theory, claimed that human beings are born without any mental content. This theory said that everything we know, everything we believe, and every reason we behave the way we do is constructed entirely by culture and experience after we're born. In the old nature versus nurture debate, this position came down squarely on the side of nurture as the source of human behavior and culture. The other theory took a more nuanced approach and argued that culture and experience had little ability to create the content of our minds, but did have significant ability to shape it during the early formation of our nervous system. This position claimed that nature and nurture must always work together in an intricate dance to explain human behavior and culture. During the years since I left grad school, I've come to the conclusion that both sides in this nature versus nurture debate are wrong. Nurture is nature. It's all nature. And the division of nurture from nature is completely artificial and meaningless. We are primarily creatures of our biology. Or so I thought, until I came squarely up against an intriguing problem in quantum physics that made me think twice about my conclusion. In this series, I use what I learned to give my answers to the three questions that pushed my lifetime of work and the implications for our future. Where do we come from? What makes us human? What makes each of us the unique person we are?